bit dense. So
Yeah, we've tried to eliminate paper, so things, we're not handing out a bunch of stuff. I'm sure that it's...
So what my presentation is basically about is it's a nerd-focused themed animal rights presentation. So I'm going to be trying to do something that I don't think a lot of people have tried to do before, where I'm going to be trying to convince you all that the life... Louder? That the life you live is actually a little bit less rational than the fictional worlds we create. So if you can think of any work of fiction like Lord of the Rings or anything like that, it's created in a certain way and the artist has a certain kind of image they want to be portraying. And I'm here to let you know that in almost none of the interpretations of fictional worlds are any of them anything like the real world. So they might take some things that they like about the real world, but leave out the things that they don't. So I'm going to give some examples for you. So is it possible to have a view of morality without bias? So raise your hand if you've ever seen a video of a little kid finding out about meat for the first time and they realize that it's the same animals that they've been eating that they were taught that they were supposed to love. Yeah, exactly. So a lot of times in these videos, the adult will look at them and they'll think, oh, what a stupid kid, they don't know what they're talking about. Obviously humans are meant to eat meat. Which would make sense because adults have every reason to believe that they're rational and little kids aren't, because they have more critical thinking skills and they have more knowledge. However, there are disadvantages to being an adult when you're thinking about morality, and that's that you don't have a blank slate to work with. So you're kind of the victim of conditioning and bias. So when you're looking at a fake world, you might not be able to have that kind of disadvantage. So there's a concept in philosophy of the benevolent onlooker. And what a benevolent onlooker is it's something that isn't benefited or harmed by any decision that it makes. And the only purpose that the benevolent onlooker has is that it's supposed to make the world the best place that it can be. So it's used in utilitarian discussions, which is an area of philosophy where the greatest moral good is considered to be whatever increases the most pleasure for everything that can feel pleasure and decreases suffering for everything that can feel suffering. So I have a story about an alien that isn't quite as nice. So It the Clown is a shape-shifting alien from outer space that feasts on children. So what do you think of when you see the relationship between it and the little kids in the movies? Most people would think that it is the villain and the little kids are the protagonists of the story. But what if I told you that Pennywise isn't actually so bad? So when you looked at those two images, did you think free range? Did you think the children are allowed to live in their natural environment? Does not let any part of the body go to waste? And it seems like it can go on forever, that these are the sort of things that we would see on commercials for why it's justified for us to consume animals. And then it gets into the excuses. It is a different species. And it essentially goes on forever that every single excuse we make for the reasons that we should be able to consume animals just gets more and more ridiculous when we become the victims. And if you ever looked at your own canine teeth, you can notice that they're nothing close to Pennywise. So I'm not actually the first person to make this comparison, so don't call me crazy, but it actually addresses the same subject in the film, but it's not for very long. So there's a compassionate character named Mike Hanlon who's one of the kids who's victims of It the Clown. So what he does is he realizes that his place in society, or on the food chain, is very similar to the one that it believes that its place on the food chain is. So his grandfather is a sheep farmer, and the sheep farmer grandfather tries to make him do something he doesn't want to do, which is put a bolt gun to the sheep's head. So one interesting thing that I've noticed is that when I was originally in the theater watching this movie, everyone gasped when they saw that someone would ever put a bolt gun to a sheep's head, as though they have no idea how their food gets to their plate in the first place. So the children of dairy are kind of like the livestock in this situation. So what can we learn from Stephen King's It? The justifications we have for harming animals don't make any sense anymore when we're the victim. So it kind of seems like we're trying to make excuses for us harming animals, when really these excuses don't mean anything to us when we're the victim. So if you think about the most scary horror movie you've ever seen, I doubt that it comes close to anything that actually happens in real life. So have you ever seen a horror movie where there's 56 billion participants that the monster tries to destroy? And then there's an unbelievably large amount of marine animals to the point that their number can't even be measured in billions, it has to be measured in tons. Now what if that monster that killed all of these victims, of billions and billions and billions of them, decided that that wasn't good enough, and it wasn't merciful enough to just let those victims have their lives just end in death, and instead they decided to breed the victims so that the nightmare would last forever. So if this was a horror movie in real life, people actually wouldn't think it was scary, and I'll tell you why. It's because we, as the most intelligent species on the planet, believe that we're justified in doing all of these things because our processing power is the best. We're the most intelligent, we have the most complex thoughts and the most complex morality. But even the most intelligent species on the planet isn't able to process a film that would operate in the scale of billions. So we create a horror so big that we can't even process it. Anyway, let's talk about My Little Pony. So this might seem like a cheap shot, because obviously horses eat grass and plants and leaves and stuff like that. But that's not always the case in My Little Pony. So maybe they don't live in a vegan society because Pinkie Pie actually consumes milk and eggs, but the cows can also talk, so maybe they just sell it to them. I don't really know. But the most important part of My Little Pony, in my opinion, is the element of kindness. So this is going to be talking about the perception that people have when they think about kindness and compassion and what they teach to their children. So this is represented by Fluttershy, who possesses a supernatural artifact called the element of kindness. She's the owner and creator of Sweet Feather Animal Sanctuary, and the reason that she's considered the pinnacle of kindness is because she's kind to animals. Which makes sense. I doubt that there's any parent that would ever watch My Little Pony and think, oh, well, that doesn't make any sense. Why is the one that's nice to animals? Because every parent inherently knows that being nice to animals makes you a nice person, or at least nicer than a person who isn't nice to animals. So it begs the question, what would we call someone who isn't nice to animals at all? And I think that people don't want to tackle that issue in real life because it makes them realize that maybe we're not as nice as we think we are if we're able to harm animals and we're able to make excuses for it. So she also has her own animal sanctuary, and it was suggested that the animals ever be kept in cages, and she blew up at them. So these are lessons that a child can understand. So going back to the idea of the horror that I mentioned earlier, is that when people hear about stories of animals being hurt, they view animals as victims. But whenever an animal horror story has to do with the largest thing that impacts animals, the largest animal rights issues, which is factory farming and things similar, we suddenly don't see animals as victims anymore. So on an individual basis, animals are victims, but they're not victims when it occurs at such a large rate. So anyway, I'm done talking about horse people for right now. We're going to move on to BoJack Horseman. So anthropomorphic animals and humans live in the same society in BoJack Horseman. So as I'm sure you've all seen, anthropomorphic animals, or basically human-animal hybrids, are very common in cartoons. It's actually hard to say whether it's more common for anthropomorphic animals to be in cartoons or whether just regular human cartoons. So there's some stories that address this, like for example, Zootopia. Shout out to them for living in a vegan society. They talk about animal issues and what would happen if animals were actually able to live together. And then there's some that don't address it at all. So for example, Pluto is a dog. And then Goofy also kind of looks like a dog, but isn't a dog. So why is it that all of them get to be animal-human hybrids and Pluto doesn't? Doesn't really address it. So even though that this section is titled Friend Chicken versus Food Chicken, there's actually 3 different types of chickens that are discussed in BoJack Horseman's episode, Chickens. So for reference, BoJack Horseman is a story about a washed-up 90s sitcom star and everything that follows his life after he's washed up. So it tackles very dark, humorous subjects, and it's also just very funny. So in this story, it starts off by discussing humane farms. So they try to distinguish themselves from the factory farms by saying that their chickens are treated nicely. And one of the jokes is that they say that the reason that they're treated nicely is because they're not harmed by the farmer up until the chicken gets its head cut off, and they're also able to play foosball. Which you would think, why would chickens want to play foosball? But if you think about it, those chickens actually have it better than the chickens in real life do. Because what is considered nice and humane and letting animals live in their natural environment is basically just saying that we as humans have decided what is fun for a chicken and we're going to sell it to you, which doesn't make a lot of sense. So the idea of real life is actually more absurd than what exists in this work of fiction. then Chicken for Days is a factory farm. So the CEO of Chicken for Days actually owns the factory farm and the place that sells their products. So factory farming is actually addressed extremely directly, and going back to the idea of the human horror story that I mentioned earlier, the dialogue that appears on screen is, how do you respond to allegations that factory farming is torture or cruel or like some terrifying movie about some strange dystopian society, but in this monster story, the horrifying monsters are us. So all he says is that everything we do is legal and FDA approved, therefore it is fine, which is considered a joke until you realize that that's exactly how it is in real life. So the concept of friend versus food, as I'm sure you all know because you've seen the PETA ads and things like that, there's the animals we think are friends, the animals that we think are food, and yet they possess the same characteristics that would make us bestow rights on certain pets, but not on chickens and things like that. So for example, chickens feel pain, they feel suffering and things like that, and then if you had to ask someone why it was wrong to harm a dog, they would give those same exact examples. So here's an interesting subject that I want you all to answer for me. So imagine if there's an animal and it's going through unimaginable suffering, and it's never going to get better in its entire life, it's always going to be miserable. Do you think that it would be reasonable to euthanize that animal to put it out of its misery, and be completely honest? I think so too. So a lot of people think that it would be fine to euthanize animals if their entire life is suffering. But imagine if there were some people, and don't answer this, but imagine if there was a person, right? And they said that if an animal is happy enough, we can kill it. But then they also say if an animal is sad enough, we can kill it too. So it kind of seems like people just want to kill animals, where in my opinion, the only justifiable one would be to kill an animal if it was in its best interest. So we're going to discuss the animal context first. So imagine if somebody owns a pet dog or something like that, or a pet cat, and they said, well, I've treated my pet cat very nicely now, so I'm going to congratulate myself by being able to kill and eat it. Most people would think that was terrible. It wouldn't make any sense at all, but yet that's the same reality that we accept in real life. And then it could get even worse if you do it in the human context. So imagine if there's a parent who's the most amazing parent in the entire world, and then once their kid gets to like 7 years old or something like that, they say, well, I think I've had a good job taking care of this child, so now I'm going to kill and consume it. Most people would say that's absurd, because whether we're the victims or whether we subject something else to it makes our bar of morality either go way higher or way lower. So I want you all to answer this question as well. Do you all think that the government is corrupt? Raise your hand. Do you all think that big industry is corrupt? So do you all think that the government would do a good job of regulating industry when it comes to humane practices and things like that? So why is it that people believe the humane lie when they think that whenever they go to the grocery store, these animals that are commodified and treated as objects are somehow treated just as good as we treat our pets? It's absurd when you think about it that way. So this also references the monster story that I'm going to allude to later, and also has been referenced before. So I didn't edit this presentation properly, so I apologize for putting two ofs. But on the left is a mousetrap, and what goes into mousetraps?
Excuse me.
Mice. But what if it wasn't a mouse that went into the mousetrap, except it kind of was? What if it was a Pikachu instead? Or what if it was actually worse than that? What goes into a macerator? Baby chicks, exactly. It's one of the most horrifying things in the world, but people won't accept it and people won't ever look at it if you try to show them. But what if it wasn't a chicken? It was a torchic. So, the idea of humans eating Pokemon or treating them cruelly is something that's addressed many times in the Pokemon series, and it's always considered wrong. And for the first time in a vegan's life, they're going to discuss Pokemon without actually discussing the Pokemon battles, because that's been done to death. So, in the most recent game, Pokemon Sword and Shield, they came out with Pokemon Sausage. So, whenever Nintendo would post a video about Pokemon Sword and Shield, and it had to do with the sausages, they would say, hey, so what are the sausages made out of? They can't be made out of Pokemon. And some people say, oh, they're berries, but Nintendo will just never answer the question. And like in real life, they have the best policy, and I respect that. Just don't talk about it if you want people to keep buying your product. The top comment is actually me. So, eating animals is discussed again because there's a Pokemon called Slowpoke. And the thing about Slowpoke is when you cut off its tail, it grows back. So in a way, it's kind of like an animal byproduct. And Team Rocket is evil. I'm sure everyone's familiar with Team Rocket because you're a little kid. Team Rocket is an evil organization in Pokemon, and what they do is they try to hurt Pokemon, humans, and a relationship between human and Pokemon, basically. So one of their evil schemes is that they cut off slowpoke tail and they sell them on the black market. And selling slowpoke tail is illegal, which it should be. So there's actually a very different team that exists, and it exists in Pokemon Black and White, which is a 5th generation Pokemon. So Black and White, it would be surprising that it would discuss such a moral gray area in Pokemon, but they do. So they have liberation rallies where they say that people should liberate Pokemon from their evil masters. They have speeches, and then they also train a Pokemon to go into people's brains and then leave thoughts of animal liberation, or Pokemon liberation in this case, which as an animal rights activist, I wish I could do myself. So obviously, PETA, being the people that they are, took full advantage of this new plot for a Pokemon game. So Pikachu loves Team Plasma, and then I'm not going to really talk about the circuses and dogfights because I don't have that much time, but animal testing is something that has been discussed in the Pokemon games as well as the anime, where I'm sure you're familiar with the Pokemon Mewtwo is tested on by scientists and it ends up hating humanity. And then the weirdest concept is the idea of Pokemon fur. So imagine if you lived in the Pokemon world and you saw someone wearing a Pikachu leather jacket. People would think that was the most disgusting thing they've ever seen. So this is discussed directly in the PETA game, which in my opinion people take a little bit too seriously. But they say, what if Pokemon came to the real world or we went to theirs? People always think, oh yes, the humans in Pokemon are the same, but the animals in Pokemon are different. But in reality, they think that if we went to the Pokemon world, we would treat Pokemon the same way that they're treated in the show, which is nicely and compassionately, and people love Pokemon and are obsessed with them and whatever. And we are obsessed with animals, but we definitely don't treat them the same. So based on the historical context that we've set so far with every living creature on Earth, do we really think that if Pokemon came to the real world or vice versa, we would treat them well? Probably not. So if you lived in the world of Pokemon, we support factory farms for Pokemon, cruel Pokemon testing experiments, skinning Pokemon for their fur, Pokemon battles if they cause immense suffering for Pokemon, and things like that. So one interesting thing about this is that when people look at these concepts, they're completely absurd to them. But what's not absurd, somehow, is that there's actually living, breathing, sentient creatures that we do these things to, that feel every single ounce of suffering that we inflict on them. And yet, when you tell someone that that's actually absurd, then you become the weird one. Star Trek takes a really, really weird stance on animal rights, where what they do is they don't discuss animal rights in the actual show very often. So what they do is they view it as a subject and social justice that has already come and went. So we've already decided in the time of Star Trek that animal abuse is wrong and we shouldn't farm animals anymore. So the context behind this quote is that there's an alien species that hasn't developed to that point yet, who demands to have animal meat. And what he tells him is that they don't use animals for that purpose anymore because they're beyond that. So, I'm not here to discuss toxic masculinity, and I'm not here to say whether non-toxic masculinity actually exists. All I'm saying is that if there was non-toxic masculinity, it would look like that. So the Borg is actually one of the episodes where they do discuss animal agriculture and animal rights directly. So what happens is there's this terrifying hive mind race called the Borg, and then at the episode I, Borg, they actually save one of the individual Borg from the hive mind, and they still think that it's evil, and in their defense they have every reason to believe that it is because it still has all the same thoughts and feelings that it had when it was part of that hive mind race. So Captain Picard, who's normally a selfless person, is actually completely out of character in this episode because he wants to commit genocide on the entire Borg race. But then what happens is that individual members of the Starship Enterprise start talking to the Borg, and then they start realizing that it has more in common with them than they think. And then they start teaching it things like morality and asking it questions directly, and then the Borg ends up actually agreeing with them that the Borg is bad. So if all of the Borg have the potential to be our friends and things like that, then they start bringing up the discussion of why is it that we want to commit genocide on them if they have so much potential to be our friends? There has to be some other way. So then Captain Picard brings up the idea, because he still wants to commit genocide on their species. He says, a long time ago they used to do testing on animals, and this would become a problem because once the scientists met the animals in real life, it became a problem when they had to torture and kill them. So, if you think about it like this, here's another thought experiment for you. Imagine that there's some person in some country you've never heard of, extremely far away, and that person is suffering. Do you care about them? Most people don't, and I wouldn't either, and the reason why is because I don't even know that it's happening. But what if somebody told you that the reason that that person was suffering far away was because of something that you were doing? Then you would start maybe not caring about the person, but the subject of whether you care about a person or not doesn't necessarily mean that you should treat them differently, because you don't have to care about someone specifically in order to respect them. So if all I had to do was do something different in my life so that that person didn't get tortured, I would do it. And this is one of the things that it discusses, is that once you start viewing an entity as an individual instead of just part of like some big factory farming operation, that's why we have such a different idea towards pet animals than we do towards the ones in factory farms, is that if we are able to meet these animals in person, we wouldn't do any of these things to them. And I'm really serious that all of these quotes from Star Trek are actually real. So imagine the subject of WWJD, but replace it with Spock. So what would Spock do? So Spock is a Vulcan, and the Vulcans have reached a point in their philosophy where they take a utilitarian perspective like I discussed earlier. So the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. So in this story, they try to do everything as reasonably as possible and put no emotion into it. They just want to do whatever is best for the majority. So if you think about everything logically, would it be logical to cause great harm to trillions of sentient creatures to provide ourselves with a relatively low amount of taste pleasure? Most people here, because it's Veg Fest, and I'm sure you're all biased, would say, probably not. But the thing is, the question isn't even that simple, it actually gets worse. So what if you had that same taste pleasure, but there were severe consequences? It was going to destroy the environment, and for a lot of people, it was going to destroy ourselves. Now what if it got even worse, where people just ignored the scientific evidence regarding it, and ignored all the authorities as far as nutrition and health, and animal consciousness and animal psychology and things like that, in favor of just not wanting their life to change? That would seem absolutely absurd, and that's the reason why when we create fantasy universes, a lot of the most horrible things about real life that people justify don't follow. So when they make something like Star Trek in the future, it makes absolutely no sense for a lot of the things that are mundane in our real life to carry over into a kind of utopia paradise. So why is it that we can't admit that it's wrong in the real world? So there's something that's often compared to Star Trek. There's another series called Star Fox. So I'm just kidding about this. This is just a big missed opportunity. So there's anthropomorphic animals in Star Fox, and they travel throughout space. So it's basically like BoJack Horseman and Star Trek put together, and yet they do nothing with it. Okay. So the porgs we eat and the porgs we love. So this is pretty simple. A little kid could even get this. Once Chewbacca meets one of the porgs in person that he's consuming, he realizes that it's an individual with his own thoughts and feelings. But it's actually a little bit more complex than that. So if you think about it, both Chewbacca and the porgs have something in common. They're both different species than the humans that they're mostly friends with. So in this story, why is it that humans and every other species in the world, or whatever worlds they travel to, are always friends? So whenever you see a story about a human traveling to space, they have so much respect for all of these alien species and all the creatures that exist in their world and things like that. So in the same exact movie, Star Wars: The Last Jedi, the Fathiers are kind of like the Star Wars horses. So there's a beautiful city, and Finn and Rose are two characters in Star Wars: The Last Jedi. And Finn remarks that the city is absolutely beautiful and stunning. But then Rose points out that it's actually a horrible city. So they have two perspectives on the exact same thing. But then Rose actually wins in this case because she points out that this entire society that benefits the few is actually built on the backs of suffering animals and then also slave children. So in this scene, we see something absolutely disgusting, which is someone drinking milk. So in reality, you see that when someone consumes milk, it seems normal because cow's milk is literally everywhere. But when you think of someone consuming something like their mother's breast milk when they're an adult, that could be one of the most disgusting things you've ever seen. And then if they drink pig milk, that would also be disgusting. And if they drink dog milk, that would be similarly disgusting as well. So one interesting thing about this is that Daisy Ridley is the actress that plays Rey on the right. And she is actually vegan in real life, so I can't even tell if that reaction that she has is genuine or not. But that's actually the second coolest thing about her, the first being that her name is just a combination of two Smash Bros. Characters. So, in Solo, a Star Wars story, there's a robot, and it asks the question that a lot of sci-fi things like iRobot and things like that have asked, where if artificial intelligence was able to reach the point of sentience, would artificial intelligence then deserve rights based on their needs and interests? And I want you all to actually answer that. if robots were able to become sentient and have thoughts and feelings and feel pain and suffering, should we take that into consideration when we're using them? Yes, exactly. So now imagine if instead of artificial intelligence, it was actually organic intelligence, and there was an organic life form that was able to have thoughts and feelings. So yeah, science nerds, people are able to answer that question when it comes to robots. When we discuss the same exact topic about the animals that already live here that are able to experience pain and suffering, people have a completely different idea and they think that we should dominate them. So I believe that the difference is that we aren't currently using sentient AI. So imagine if there was sentient AI and someone's life was based around it, and every day they had something created by sentient AI 3 times a day for every meal. Then they would have a very different perspective on what was moral or immoral, but because we're not currently in that situation, we have a much more objective view of what should happen. And that's that artificial intelligence should not be tortured if it was ever sentient. And similarly, organic intelligence shouldn't either. This is just a recap. So in Planet of the Apes, humanity is put on trial. So they make constant comparisons between ape society and human society. So Taylor, for context, is a human who travels into outer space and goes through some time warp, hooey-fooey sci-fi nonsense, and then ends up on a planet that's ruled by apes. And spoiler alert, what he did was he just went to space and then he landed back on the same planet in the future. But he doesn't know that at this point. So he thinks that this is going to be easy for him. And as soon as he's able to talk, the apes will see that he's intelligent and then they'll give him rights. But once he's put on trial, they see that this doesn't happen, and every single time he talks, they try to test his intelligence. And because apes have a completely different version of what they consider to be intelligent than humans do, they'll ask him questions, he can't answer the questions, he can't solve the puzzles, and therefore they think he's not intelligent. So it also reinforces their power belief because their society is set up in a certain structure that reinforces the way that they've always think, and reinforces that the apes are supreme, and then reinforces their way of life and doesn't let anything change it. So the way that ape society works is that there's a domain of faith that's dominated by orangutans, and they dominate politics because a lot of times they go hand in hand. So chimpanzees dominate the domain of science, and gorillas dominate the domain of war. So in ape society, all apes are equal, except they aren't, and I'll explain why. So orangutans have faith that teaches them that the lawgiver is the supreme giver of all rights, and the lawgiver has decided that apes are the supreme species on the planet, and the apes have every reason to believe so. So when the gorillas want to do something and they want to quash something beneath them or they want to hunt humans, they justify it because the orangutans tell them that it's okay because apes are the best. And then this reinforces faith because when they quash the humans down, it just gives more credibility to the idea that apes are the best because they're the dominant species in the world. So where does science fit into all of this? So science, by the chimpanzees, they discover things. And some of the things may fit in line with the order that they try to preserve in ape society, but some of it doesn't. So what faith has done is they have made it so that science from the chimpanzees has to run by all of their new ideas through the orangutans, and if the orangutans believe that it's good for their society, they agree with it, and then they discard it if they don't think it's good for their society. So in real life, are there politicians and industries and things like that, that if science comes up that proves that we should change our way of life, are there politicians and industries that say we should just ignore all of that science because it's going to interfere with our way of life? Of course there is, definitely. And this was created in like 1968 or something like that. So the concept of freedom in language is very prominent, right? So imagine that there's a dog in real life, and then that dog growls at you when you try to touch it. Most people would see that as a sign of aggression, and then if that dog bit someone, they could have that dog put to death, man's best friend. So now imagine that you have some sympathy for that dog, and you actually view that growling as a sign of peace. Because what gives us the right as humans to be able to touch an animal in any way that we want? That animal could have been abused in the past, and even if it wasn't, it has no reason to trust humans, obviously. So this is the same exact situation that Taylor is in, where he's constantly put in cages throughout the movie, and every time he tries to escape, and for reference, he can't talk to the apes because he has a throat injury. So language is everything in ape society. And the humans can't talk, which is why they aren't given rights. So in one of the movies, Escape from the Planet of the Apes, there's the scientists and the chimpanzees, orangutans and politicians, and gorillas and soldiers that are all able to meet each other, so the references I made before are actually seen directly. So what happens is the scientists and chimpanzees are friends. So when they meet the animal psychologist loves them and tests them, and then they start to see that the same ways that they didn't believe human intelligence on their planet is very similar to the way that the human psychologists treat them. So in one of the experiments, they have Dr. Zira solve a puzzle in which she has to get a banana by stacking a bunch of blocks together and then climbing on top of them. And then she gets to the top of the tower, doesn't grab the banana, stares at the animal psychologist, and up to this point she's never talked. And then they just stare at each other for a second, and then he turns to one of his peers and says, I don't understand why she's not taking the banana. And then she screams at him, because I loathe bananas. I like grapes. So this is a reference to what we originally did when we were testing ape intelligence, is we would try to get them to talk to us. And we would say, oh, apes aren't as smart as we thought they may have been because they can't talk to us. But then science realized later that the reason that apes can't talk in any capacity whatsoever is because they don't have the vocal apparatus to do so. They don't have the anatomy. But because we only view human intelligence in forms of being able to have human speech, things are completely different. So the orangutans and the politicians, the chimpanzees meet politicians in the real world, which are basically the orangutans of their world. And then the politicians actually love the chimpanzees until they realize that it's going to destroy their way of life if they let the chimpanzees live, or so they think. So the chimpanzees tell the story of the ape who said no. So what happens in this story is that in the future, but before the Planet of the Apes, the first movie, what happens is there's a plague that wipes out all human pets. So because gorillas, chimpanzees, and orangutans aren't affected, humans in their arrogance decide that they should have the apes as pets. So what they do is they have them do forced labor, so they wait tables and things like that, and things that apes can do. And then they've always rejected their position in society. So what happens at this point is the apes say no by grunting, they pull away and things like that, but the humans don't care. And then one day there's an ape who says no and everything changes. So they specify that apes have always said no. And similar to this, cows will chase after their calves when they're taken away, and they're crying for days. And then there's also pigs who bite at the bars and things like that, so they fight back against the situation that they're in. But as the anonymous or the voiceless co-runner, this sounds really weird for me to say, but our entire organization doesn't make any sense because animals actually do have a voice, but we just choose not to listen. So when a cow is crying out for its calf, we know what it's trying to say, we just refuse to listen. And then eventually when they decide that apes are a threat to their way of life, they start to ask them more questions, and then they realize that there was an uprising by apes, and they realize that there was a war between apes and humans that ended up with the world being destroyed. So the chimpanzees try to specify, because they think they're still friends, and they say, oh, okay, well, you don't understand. So it was actually the apes who were justified in this situation. It was actually a bomb that was created by humans, and the humans also deployed it. But all the humans care about is that apes have now been a threat to their way of life, and then at the end of the movie, the main characters of Escape from Planet of the Apes don't escape from the Planet of the Apes. They're actually just killed by the soldiers. So the movie takes on a whole new meaning, and then you realize that every single Planet of the Apes movie is a planet dominated by apes, but it's just a matter of which apes the planet is dominated by at that period in time. So Dr. Zaius is the villain of the first movie, and what he does is he justifies his treatment of the humans because of the faith that he possesses. So the lawgiver instructs that apes are the superior species on the planet, and therefore they can do whatever they want. But then once some of the scripture is actually read, you start to realize that not all of the ideas are lies in what the lawgiver says, and that humans really are destroying the world. And in a lot of ways, ape society is actually nicer than the society we've created for animals, in the sense that apes do not destroy other apes, apes are vegetarians, chimpanzees are pacifists, and they actually treat us nicer than we treated the apes. So basically, this is long, I'm running out of time, but imagine if there were a bunch of consoles, right? We were trying to decide what was the best console. Thank you. And then you realize that one of the consoles had the highest processing power, but as a consequence, it would destroy the entire world over a period of hundreds of years. So humans, we use that same kind of justification where we say, oh, we're the smartest animal in the world, therefore we can do literally anything we want, we can destroy the planet, and we can essentially have a suicide mission where we kill ourselves, and then we take every single species on Earth down with us. So most people would look at that if they were trying to decide what the best species was, and they would say, maybe humans actually aren't the coolest species in the world, because they ruin everything for everyone else. So there's a story, have you ever heard someone say something along the lines of, humans are the best species, we're the top of the food chain, therefore we can do whatever we want. So what if an alien abducted them, and then they said that same exact thing to them, and then killed and consumed them. Oh, sorry, wrong picture. So this is actually the plot of Madoka Magica. So there's an alien that comes to Earth that feeds on little children, and I actually use the same weird example twice in the same presentation because the clown is literally the exact same story. Cruella de Vil, the guy who shot Bambi's mom, they're just real people in real life that we see every day. Scuba diver who captured Finding Nemo, Clayton from Tarzan, they're just people that actually exist in real life, but yet they meet the qualification to be a Disney villain. So what makes a story worth telling? So there's a threat, and then there's a hero that deals with the threat. In Attack on Titan, the main character is Eren, who fights back against the Titans, and then there's Armin, who is his friend and supporting character. But Eren makes fun of Armin because at the beginning of the story he's not fighting back against the Titans, and he calls him a coward, and he says that he's just submitting to all of the threats of their world like cattle to the farmer. But I don't think that this is a fair comparison because it's not like cattle just let us do whatever we want to them, and our livestock are the exact same way. They fight back, and like I said earlier, pigs will bite at the bars, cows will chase after the calves and reject being slaughtered and things like that. So it begs the question of what makes a story worth telling, because if a villain just slaughters a hero, a lot of times you don't see a story like that. So what if this happened in nature? Which it does. So what is it that's the difference between a mantis consuming a butterfly, a human consuming livestock, and then titans consuming humans? And it starts to ask the question of, the food chain seems like something that's really, really awesome until humans aren't at the top anymore. And then we start to question its actual morality about the whole system of the food chain in general, and whether it's best for us at all. So there is a period when nothing becomes an individual. So when a cow escapes on its way to the slaughterhouse, or a pig jumps off of a cart, it suddenly becomes from something that isn't considered literally at all to a hero. And it's not even necessarily saying that it survived, it's just saying that there was a villain, and then they escaped from something that was trying to kill them. So would someone listen to a story about a victim that fights back but doesn't win? No one wants to hear that story. Okay, 2 more slides. And does that mean that their story doesn't matter anymore? So I think that their story does matter, and I think that stories that have a sad ending actually do matter because they tell us that something went wrong and there's something that we should change. So in Attack on Titan, a lot of times, there's times where the villain is about to crush the hero, and this happens all the time in works of fiction. So the villain's about to crush the hero, and then someone pops in at the end of the day, and then saves the hero. But in real life, that doesn't happen for animals. Animals just die, and then they're reborn with their children, and then they die again, and then they die again, and they die again. So what if I told you that I actually told you a fantasy story throughout this presentation, and that's that animals are never heroes, and there's no one that pops in at the end of the day to make sure that animals have a happy ending. So it may be true that animals don't always have a happy ending, and people only want to listen to stories in which animals have a happy ending. But the secret of this presentation is that stories don't only exist in fantasy, and every single creature on this planet that is able to have experiences also has a story. So if people only want to listen to stories that have a happy ending, I believe that we should give them to them. And this is like a graveyard for all the ideas that I had that didn't end up making it into the presentation. So thank you for listening.